Last night I did a little sharing of my story with a family group of people that are loved ones of people diagnosed with mental health conditions. And the first hour they do their class material, and then the second hour I share my story. And I've done it a couple of times before. And so I was actually struck by the conversation that happened. They read a part of the material that says, recovery is the development of a new ego and identity structures to replace those damaged by our illnesses. Recovery is about wellness, that is, the redevelopment of a new and healthier personality and lifestyle, an independent personality that is strong enough to stand on its own. Recovery takes place through creation of new patterns of behavior that make our lives more satisfying and productive. And from that, there was a conversation by the parents and loved ones, and they were kind of saying how their loved ones are in the grief stage of they can't get back to who they were before. So when I shared my story, I talked about that I believe it is about creating a new self. You can't really get back to the one that you were before. And I didn't really say, but if a person gets stuck in the grief phase, it's going to make it so one can't really move into this phase of rediscovery and recreation of oneself. And that may include some of the old structures. And then this sheet goes on to be like, oh, you got to give up your hopes and dreams and build a dream of lesser whatever and stuff, which is kind of old thinking, but they're trying to put it in like a positive light. But I still think that it's important to harvest one's mania if one had mania and move towards that, not just about developing patterns of behavior and personality structures to help one function as a cog in the machine of society, because it's a cog in the machine of society that we're all suffering from, and certain number of us go into these supposed crisis mental illness states, and it's a state of connecting with a different compass that wants us to create a different reality where we don't have to go into these states of crisis. It's trying to show us something. It's trying to show us that we're all one thing, we're all one consciousness, and we need to co-create towards that. So that's why I don't really believe in personal recovery, to just personally recover enough function to somewhat function in society. And that's why I feel like I've done the best when I've been living in community or had a lot of interactions that are just based on being human and not really focused on mental illness at all. So I was pretty inspired by just hearing their dialogue before I spoke. I didn't say anything about it. I was just listening to them. But it seems like ever since that time I shared a couple of months ago, and the woman said she's starting to believe her son that, hey, if we all acted this way, we would create a different world or something, whatever she said. Each time I go to something mental health related, it's usually a pleasant surprise in the perspective people are taking. And the one lady at the group yesterday even said, well, if they went back to their original personality, that would just mean they would be back to the beginning again. They would be mentally ill again, because that sort of was part of what caused the mental illness. It was concurrent with the occurrence of the supposed mental illness. And I was like, wow, that's kind of spot on, because I think I might have said that before, where something new has to come into play. So I definitely grieved the loss of my former self for several months, but then I was like, okay, well, I've got nothing to lose and everything to gain now, so let's see what happens. So I find it interesting that it's right in the literature of a family support group class that basically we need to create a new self, and that's why I've talked about embodied mania and harvesting and practicing and embodying. Because some of the grief is, at least for people that go into mania, is grieving the loss of manic consciousness, but we can still move toward that. And I was talking yesterday about how when it comes to psychosis, they often say, oh, the more it happens, the worse it gets. And I think the more it happens, the more one gets medicated, and it's justification for more and more and different, and it's justification for more and more medication. And then that makes it worse, and because it's not getting resolved or moved through, and then it just makes it seem like, oh, it gets worse each time, when they don't necessarily say, well, each time we medicate more, we whatever, because I had my fourth psychosis and I was put on medication that made it worse. And then when I was taken off that medication, within a month or so, I was back to myself. So had I stayed on that medication, I likely would have continued to get worse, which would have looked like, oh, I'm getting worse because I had another psychosis, blah, blah, blah. When the 2 times before, I was out in and out of the hospital within 10 days and then back to normal activities. So I knew, and I know that it happens. Doesn't mean it's going to make me deteriorate to a worse off state, because that hasn't been the case. And I think it could be also that through this process of rediscovering and recreating myself, I've actually recreated a version of myself that is more in alignment with manic consciousness and what I experienced in mania and relational aspects and things like that. So when I go into a crisis state and I come out of it, I'm kind of back to how I was, because it's more real. Whereas the initial crisis was trying to break down a lot of the false structures. And then through living in community, I was able to build a different relational self. And that could be where a lot of my strength is that I have that community. And I made some notes when editing my videos from yesterday, and I was thinking about how my intention with these videos is to open the doors of my mind and your mind. And that is my gesture. That's the gesture of these words. That's the intention. Because I was thinking about how gestures are more powerful. So if this is all condensed into one gesture, it's sort of learning in self-dialogue in order to keep this brain learning and use this brain instead of having the brain use me. And that's the thing with being diagnosed with something. It's often now the brain is using me because it has this pathological diagnosis. So everything I do is based on avoiding things around that diagnosis. And I prefer to thrive, dive, and revive. And I was thinking how this learning and always learning and not accumulating, as J. Krishnamurti would say, it's always different. And so it's a different motion. It's a motion that is always unfolding and changing as it unfolds, whereas thinking is sort of this circular reflex in the brain. So I was thinking that thinking is actually re-motion, not as in re-emotion, but re-motion. It's the same motion happening in the brain, which is circular, so it's actually in action because it's talking about something from the past. So the brain can be in motion, unfolding, always seeing something new. And Krishnamurti talked about compassion and how it's always new, it's always different, it's always changing. And so compassion, that word, that static word, encompasses that unfolding. And I was thinking that manic consciousness is kind of like compassion then, because every moment is so different and rich and diverse and new. It's almost like the learning process I'm going through right now through self-dialogue, but actually in interaction with actuality out there. This is the gesture of the intention for my brain to be learning in this way and learning through self-dialogue, but it can also be in dialogue with actual people out in actuality. And it's a very powerful process when that happens. So I think manic consciousness is actually similar to compassion, which is similar to empathy. in that it's always different. It depends on the moment. It depends what you're perceiving. What you're perceiving is what you're empathizing with. Otherwise, you're not empathizing because you're not actually seeing it. And this re-motion of the brain, which is thought, doing similar motions or the same motion over and over again and repeating itself, is tied to re-emoting, which is re-emoting dopamine. Or it could be different emotions, but they're linked to dopamine because we derive some kind of pleasure out of those emotions by, as Dr. David Hawkins would say, by taking a positionality. By taking a position, by judging, by comparing, by measuring, we're getting some kind of juice, as he would say. And he said mainly the only process is to surrender the juice that you get out of taking a positionality. And I was thinking also how motion catches our attention, and I was talking about that in the last video. And so if we're always re-motioning with thought, same motion, similar motion, same 10 or 100 thoughts every day, we're naturally going to be habituated to it. And we're not even really going to notice that it's going on like that. And when we get habituated to it, we get bored. And so we're bored in our life just because we're always hearing our voice going on. We're not actually perceiving what's happening now. And I've talked about already how the images of the ego thought process get in the way of the mind screen and pure perception, which is learning. So this re-motion over and over of thinking. So I could think of thinking in the ego as re-motioning and creating motion out of old past experiences by going from image to image to image of the past. It's old motion. It's not being in touch with the motion and what's going on and the patterns of the present moment. And we would never get bored of that, but we get bored because we have this re-motion going on in our head and we're habituated to it, and that is the habit. So when that's going on and talking to us, it's sort of lulling us to sleep so we can go through our habitual day. And the thing with habits that I thought of is that it becomes a habit when we can do it automatically and then let this voice just start droning on again. So the voice is going on and we're bored and we're doing our habits. So we're kind of living this really boring life. So if we were always doing new things or perceiving anew and learning anew, we wouldn't have that voice, or we can't have that voice going on because that voice comes on when we are in habit mode. So we're nearly always in habit mode, and that's why when we're driving, we're just thinking of old things and that goes on and on. So they always talk about forming new habits, and to me it just means do something new to turn off that voice for a while and actually focus, and then do it enough times that it becomes so automatic in the neural networks that now you can just start talking about the past again and boring yourself to tears. So memory is a movement of the past meeting the movement of the present, and we're not moved by the present, we're moved by our past. We're animated by our ego thought memory complexes. We're not animated by interacting with the present moment. We can't unfold as the present moment with the present moment when we're re-unfolding old memories. And again, it's just painful memory, oh, lacking dopamine, pleasant memory, oh, dopamine, and just back and forth like that. So we become this like binary compass. It's like we become this rudder on a boat. You have to go this way and you got to go that way, and you got to go this way and you got to go that way in order to go in a straight line. And then that's our ego habit, and then we call that our personality, we call that our self. And then when manic consciousness or some other process and that energy comes in and breaks it up, and we're confused and lost and scared and perceiving all these things that we probably missed along the way, we think that we've lost something special, when it's that process that's trying to help break up this habitual thing There's so much out there about reach your goals, develop a new habit. Are we robots? And I realize this dopamine reflex of the ego images is like a protective mechanism. And I can't remember if I talked about it, but by having these images on our mind screen and just reacting to that, we don't actually have to react and see what's happening in the present moment. So what's happening in the present moment unfolds as something new every second. And it's a very rich and diverse process, but we're processing our old images. So by doing that, we're giving ourselves comfort and security that we have some kind of control over things, when really we're just supposedly controlling the images in our mind and supposedly choosing the images in our mind, but that doesn't have anything to do with this moment. And by doing that process, we're lulling ourselves to sleep and allowing ourselves to become habits. And by becoming habits, we feel safe because we don't really go outside our comfort zone much. And it has nothing to do with actuality. It's just this image process in our mind that's keeping us in habit by talking about the past. And it's probably talking about the past because we're doing the same old thing. We become this habit. So it's talking about something old because we're not actually doing anything new. And so we're living our whole lives in our minds like that. We're not actually present. So I don't think that forming habits is the way to live a rich life. And these past images giving us this hit of dopamine makes us feel like we're actually living because we get this little hit of pleasure. And we only know pleasure, pain, and the few emotions that go along with it. We don't understand all this other spectrum of consciousness and experience, mainly because we're afraid of it and we're not tuned into it. And I think manic consciousness and map consciousness comes in order to try to attune us to that. So it breaks up the old ego structures, which automatically makes us vulnerable to going anywhere from the highest ecstasy to the lowest of the low. But we need to go through the entire spectrum in this process of map consciousness in order for us to really feel for real, to actually feel for real, instead of just having a fear by producing fearful images in our head of the past and fearing what might happen. We get to experience extreme terror. And a lot of times it'll play like stories and delusions and hallucinations of why it is we're feeling that way, because it's relating, well, these are the types of experiences that would give you this sensation. And they're not happening to you now, but this is what other people have experienced in the world when they've had these terrible, awful experiences. And it feels like one is experiencing those things. And also to the highest, but it's a way for us to actually tune our nervous system into the proper 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 possible, unique, empathetic, unfolding experiences that arise in consciousness when we're actually one in relationship with what it is that we are unfolding. So I feel like it's a retuning process, and it can be scary as crap. It's like restart, it's recalibration. It's recalibrating our nervous system. Our nervous system and our nerves and everything has been hijacked by just dopamine and the me and the past images of the me and worrying about oneself. And when one's worrying about oneself, as in one's past images, one's not actually in the present moment and not experiencing the richness of that. So in order for us to actually experience the richness of that, we need this recalibration process. And so we don't notice our voice because it's always on. We don't notice that we're talking in our own voice. And since it's always on, we take it to be something valuable in ourselves. And when we get in the state of awe, when we see a beautiful sunset, for example, it turns off for a second and we feel one with that experience. And sometimes people feel that and they're like, I want that back. And then they try things to get that back. And then map consciousness comes in and is trying to get rid of that voice or get rid of the way that voice is using us in our own heads. And so it's an awe experience. But awe is a word to describe infinite experiences within that awe. It's not, this is what awe is, or, oh, this is what gave me awe, so I'm going to do that again and expect to get awe. And when we're in map consciousness, it's an empathetic state. It's one with the moment. And so whatever one perceives, one feels. And it can be really confusing, because if one actually perceives and feels, one's going to act in a different way versus not actually perceiving, because one's in one's ego consciousness. That voice is blocking true perception and it's rationalizing things. So when we have that voice, we're not guided by the motion of the universe, because we're re-emotioning with our mind. And by doing that, it basically destroys the brain. And when we're always re-emotioning in this way, we're not allowing new neural pathways to develop, because we're reinforcing old ones that create those images and feelings. It's tied into the feelings too, because we emote, and that creates the complement in terms of neural peptides in the body. And I was thinking about how when we're always releasing the same few emotional molecules in the body, there's more receptors for those. And those receptors are the actual musical score of our body. They're like the notes of our body on each of our cells. They're what our cells can perceive. And since we're always re-motioning with our brain, we're creating those receptors in our body. And the more we do the same emotions, they actually down-regulate the receptors. So we need more of those emotions in order to get our fix of the emotion, and likely the dopamine too. So that's always wanting more and more and more, something different. We want something different that's going to give us the same emotion. So it's actually the same thing. It's the same experience all the time, because it's the same, or the same few emotions. Whereas if we weren't desiring those emotions and addicted to our emotions, we would actually perceive in the moment and have a different motion, being moved by the universe and perceiving and learning every moment, which gives us energy. And really what we want is that energy. And dopamine gives us like a little tiny shot of it. But when we're learning and perceiving, we have a different form of energy. And I think it's an energy that creates lots of new neural pathways in the brain and variations in the neural peptides and things in the body, so then it's varied and we don't get stuck on any one thing. And especially when we get to the point where we realize that we really don't need to get stuck on any one thing, because there's always something new to learn coming. And so we allow it to unfold as us and move us, and we don't have to seek it out. So the motion of learning replaces the re-motion of me and my memories. And the re-motion of memories is re-emoting dopamine. And I think there's a different intention behind this motion. And I think the motion has something to do with intelligence beyond the ego. Re-motion is not intelligence. And I was thinking it's more difficult to learn by taking in someone's words, because someone's words actually has to write over the words in one's own voice. So it has to get through that barrier. And one's own voice, ego, is always looking to confirm what it already thinks to be true. So it'll only let in things that confirm the associations it's already making. The ego doesn't do very much extrapolating and inferring and hypothesizing or pattern recognition. And I was thinking about how harvesting and embodying one's mania and practicing one's mania and altruism, those are all gestures. And I think those gestures are more powerful at changing one's voice inside. There's value in getting rid of the voice, but in the meantime, to change the voice, if we change how we are. And that's why I feel like, since I was able to help out so much in the beginning after having a crisis, I didn't as much self-stigmatize, as they say, because I was being helpful, I was being useful, I was being part of the community. I felt like I belonged. So that would innately change one's inner voice, or change one's story, or reframe what happened to one if one is able to do those sort of gestures. Whereas sitting on the couch, the gesture of just sitting there is not going to do anything to change that. So action can work to change that voice a bit, more so than words. And that's why I'm looking forward to getting in the action phase. And I also think that the gestures write over the old patterns implicit in the voice and the story and memories that the voice is choosing to speak about. It's not just writing over the voice in a linear fashion. It's actually, the voice is going to create different words and stories based on the patterns inside. And the patterns inside are usually due to one's actions, or maybe the patterns received from outside. And I think that's part of what manic consciousness does, is trying to repattern us by giving us different gestures and actions and degrees of freedom. Because not only does it free us to recalibrate to the entire spectrum of consciousness and empathy, it also, at the same time, when being calibrated, it's also calibrating different actions and gestures that we didn't even know we were necessarily capable of until we were recalibrated in this way. So after being recalibrated, one can have a really scary experience where one might think they might kill somebody because they're in that state of consciousness. And one can live the rest of their life in fear that, oh my gosh, I thought that, or I had that urge. But to me, it's a calibration, and that way, moving forward in the harvest practice embody, we can choose what it is we want to reinforce in our neural networks. And as we reinforce those higher gestures and higher states of consciousness, the likelihood of us going into a space where we're going to feel that again is less. And it's more about being calibrated to that and seeing that possibility and seeing how that happens to people, and having some empathy for people that go through that, more so than thinking that one is going to necessarily become that. It's about calibrating empathy. I was thinking about my thinking process and how my brain doesn't think in terms of circular ego loops. And so usually when I have a thought, it's more like an insight. It's just like a total sentence. It's a total complete thought in one go, and it's not really in my own voice. It's more like a silent whisper. I don't even really hear it. I just sort of know it. And most of the time when I think in that way, it's something I want to write down. And other than that, I don't really think unless it's something that I'm wanting to write down. When I speak in conversation, I would say that I just open my mouth and speak. So when I do that, I don't have even that whisper at all. It's more like it just comes out when I open my mouth. So there's no whisper. And the whisper is more if I want to write something down. And it could be that manic consciousness and MAP consciousness is suppressed allostatic load, all the things that we didn't deal with. And that goes along with what I was saying about how our muscles tense over time, and then when we get freed of that, well, where does all that energy go? When we're freed of that tension, it can easily come into our consciousness and feed us images of past, present, possible future, of self and other. Because it could be other too, because if something happened to me and it's like stored in a muscle and that's released when I'm in manic consciousness, that storage could actually be not just what happened, but everything that led up to that happening. So it could be stored in the muscle, not just as this was the event, but all the extrapolations and inferences in that, all those extrapolations and inferences are now available to my consciousness, in that I can recognize those patterns and see the possibility of something similar happening. And that's why I think people get like really anxious and stuff, because all of society is designed for not the greatest things to happen to people. And so that's also why when it's released, when one goes into the lower end of the spectrum of MAP consciousness, one feels all those things relating to that event and all the extrapolations, not just, oh, that was a painful event for me. And one can also see how it relates to other people. And so it's like an unfolding and very rich thing to be able to extrapolate all the empathy related to that thing and everything that led up to that. And it could almost be that when one gets calibrated to the spectrum of MAP consciousness after the fact, one can utilize that empathy moving forward to inform how one wants to embody one's mania and harvest, practice, embody. It wouldn't include things that led up to that event, because one was able to go through it and see all the subtle nuances and why one would not want to participate in that.